Traditionally, Britain's ports had specific roles. On the east coast, Hull was the main trading port for northern Europe, Scandinavia and the Baltic. Newcastle was a coal-exporting port, and London was the most important port for the imperial trade with East Africa and the Far East, with the ships of the British India Line, the Orient Line and P&O largely based there. Southampton on the south coast was mainly a passenger port for services to North America. The great Cunard White Star liners, including the Queen Mary, Aquitania, Mauretania, and the almost complete Queen Elizabeth, started their record-breaking voyages from the port. On the west coast, the major ports for North America were Liverpool and Birkenhead. Manchester was home to Cunard's cargo operation, and the company's Port Line, Harrison Line, and the Blue Star Line. Trade with South America was conducted via the Bristol Channel ports. With war looming on the horizon, this pattern of trade had to change. A shift took place away from the more vulnerable ports of the south and east towards the ports of the west and north that were further from the enemy. Similarly, the traditional naval bases of Plymouth, Portsmouth and Chatham were just too close to Germany. So the escorts followed the merchant ships to the north and west, with the major units moving to bases in Scotland. To have a serious effect on Britain's trade with her empire and with her North American partners, the U-boats would have to operate in the western approaches, either north of Ireland into the Clyde or through St George's Channel into the Irish Sea and Liverpool. These waters had proved rich grounds for the U-boats of the Kaiser's navy, and the first successes of the German submarines had been achieved west of Ireland. It would be some time before U-boats in sufficient numbers were available to take the war further afield. It would also be in this region that the Royal Navy initially deployed its meagre anti-submarine forces. The Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy through most of the Battle of the Atlantic was Admiral of the Fleet Sir Dudley Pound. As First Sea Lord, he was responsible for all the operational and administrative aspects of the British Navy. He was appointed to the job at the age of 62 in June 1939, having been Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean. In some respects, though, he was an odd choice. He suffered from arthritis in his left leg that disturbed his sleep and gave him a pronounced limp. Although this disability never affected his judgment, it did account for certain aspects of his personality. He lacked humour, had no interests outside his work, and he found delegation difficult. Some of his colleagues believed him to be a pressure cooker, barely under control. But his long experience as a naval officer that included the Battle of Jutland and a first-class brain enabled him to cope with the stresses and strains of working with Winston Churchill. He had the courage to resist some of Churchill's wilder naval schemes, helping the war effort considerably. Once he was left in peace to conduct a purely naval operation from the Admiralty, Pound showed sound personal judgment and a readiness to take responsibility for fateful decisions. He was correct more often than he was proved wrong. Certainly no one could criticize Pound's devotion to his duty and the cause for which he was fighting. Admiral Sir Max Houghton is the British naval officer whose name is most synonymous with the victory of the Battle of the Atlantic. He was appointed Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches on the 19th of November 1942 and bore that responsibility until the end of the war. Houghton was the third officer to hold the post. The first had been a hero of the First World War, Admiral Sir Martin Dunbar-Naismith, who had earned the Victoria Cross for his exploits as a submarine commander in the Mediterranean. Dunbar-Naismith's problems had been huge, and he should take the credit for establishing the first escort groups and a training regime to enable escort crews to approach their task in the most professional manner possible. He formed a tactical training school at Liverpool for escort officers and a workup facility at Tobermory on the Isle of Mull, where ships could practice their tactics under the watchful eye of the notorious Vice Admiral Gilbert Stevenson, the terror of Tobermory. Dunbar-Naismith was also responsible for the relocation of the Western Approaches HQ from Plymouth to Derby House in Liverpool, where it was much closer to the heart of the battle. It was shortly after this move, on the 17th of February 1941, that he was relieved as Commander-in-Chief by Admiral Sir Percy Noble. Dunbar Naismith remained as Commander-in-Chief of the Plymouth Command. Admiral Noble was an agile, clever and popular officer, known for his fastidious dress and cleanliness. But apart from his personal eccentricities, Noble was responsible for much of the victory his command eventually achieved over the German U-boats. In particular, he devoted much effort to improving cooperation between the Royal Navy and Coastal Command of the Royal Air Force, in which he was ably assisted by the then Commander-in-Chief Coastal Command, Air Vice Marshal J.M. Robb. This essential inter-service partnership was enhanced with the transfer of operational control of Coastal Command from the RAF to the Admiralty on the 15th of April 1941. The possibility of transferring Coastal Command bodily to the Navy was considered, but rejected for bureaucratic reasons. In his efforts to improve relations and operational compatibility between the Americans, Canadians and the British, Noble had some success. To enable him to continue with this part of his task, he was relieved as Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches on the 19th of November 1942 and appointed as head of the British Naval Mission in Washington. He was replaced by Admiral Sir Max Horton, who was until then Flag Officer Submarines. Horton, a much more flamboyant figure than Noble, had been handed the blueprint for victory. He looked young for his 60 years and had been a submariner from the beginnings of his naval career. After joining the Royal Navy's submarine service in 1904, he commanded his first boat a year later. He served in submarines throughout the First World War and gained distinction by being the first British submarine commander to sink a German warship. To mark this victory, he introduced the custom of flying the skull and crossbones on return from a successful patrol, a custom still practiced in the Royal Navy today. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Horton was the Vice Admiral in command of the Reserve Fleet and was briefly in command of the Northern Patrol until Churchill appointed him head of the Navy's submarine arm. Once given command of the Western Approaches, Horton became the archetypal poacher-turned-gamekeeper. Horton's reputation for decisive leadership earned him the job, as well as the fact that he had more knowledge of submarine operations than any other officer on the Allied side. As Flag Officer Submarines, most of his effort had been devoted to the running of the Royal Navy's small and widely scattered submarine force. Now he had to turn his talents and enthusiasm to a strategic situation. His abrasive style soon earned him the nickname of Fire Eater among his subordinates. Further down the line, he was described in rather less respectful terms. He could be dealt with in one of two ways, either by complete submission or a resistance based on superior knowledge. But to resist Horton required courage and confidence. Few possessed this, one of them being his intelligence advisor, Commander Roger Wynne, head of the submarine tracking room. After what could be described as a frank exchange of views during which Horton accused Wynne of incompetence, Wynne took Admiral Horton down to the intelligence cell, showed him all the information available, and asked for Horton's advice on how to handle it. Horton, having studied the mass of information for a few minutes, gave in. "Well, I think this is a bit outside my field. It's yours, Roger." This is as close as Horton ever got to conceding a position, and was the basis for a mutual trust between him and Commander Wynne for the rest of the war. Admiral Ernest King was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the United States Navy in December 1941. In March of the following year, he combined this post with that of Chief of Naval Operations, becoming not only the administrative head of the U.S. Navy, but also its operational commander. After the Senate confirmed him in the post for 4 years, he remained in the position for the duration of the war. In some respects, he was a strange choice. King was a true Anglophobe. He detested almost everything British. For Roosevelt to appoint him to a position where close relationships with the British would determine the success of the Atlantic campaign seemed almost deliberately provocative on the president's part. At the high command level, General George Marshall, President Roosevelt's chief of staff, was almost the complete opposite. His regard for the British was high, and his relations with Churchill and most British commanders were good. So, to some extent,